Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panelists. Geoffrey T. Fong, PhD, Professor of Psychology and Public Health and Health System, University of Waterloo, Canada, will deliver the topic, Impact of FCTC Implementation and its Unleashed Potential. Ms. Mary Assunta, Senior Policy Advisor, Southeast Asia Tobacco Control Alliance, will deliver on topic, Tobacco Industry Misdeeds Against Tobacco Control Measures. Our honorable speaker, Professor Emil Salim, Advisor of National Committee on Tobacco Control Indonesia, will deliver on topic, Tobacco Control Measures, Global Intimidation or Nation's Demand. Please welcome our honorable moderator, Dr. Mira Agi.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we will go right into the topic because I want to give a huge chance to our audiences to ask questions because it's a very, very important topic that we are covering, the 5.3. Since its first adoption in 2003, WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control ratification has covered nearly 90% of the world's population. Studies showed the potential of WHO FCTC to significantly reduce health and economic burden from tobacco-related illness and death by reducing millions of smokers globally. However, many countries are still left behind in implementing demand reduction tobacco control measures by the standards by the WHO FCTC standard. The mean number of these policies implemented was only 1.04 out of 5. Now we all know that the WHO FCTC was adopted in May 2003 and came into force in February 2005. At the last conference of the parties in Delhi in 2016, the Impact Assessment Expert Group gave its report on the impact of the treaty in its first decade. Professor Geoffrey Fong of the ITC project at the University of Waterloo was the member of the Impact Assessment Expert Group, and I would like to invite him to talk briefly about the findings of this expert group. Specifically, what was the impact of the FCTC on reducing smoking over the treaty's first decade, and what more could have been achieved by stronger implementation of FCTC globally and in the Asia-Pacific region. Jeff is going to make a presentation, and I think that he's going to cover whatever he wants to say in his first attempt only. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Mira. I'm going to, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to stand up because I have to point to some slides, so I can't really do it from where I'm sitting. But thank you very much. It's a wonderful pleasure and honor to be here to talk about the FCTC. As Mira mentioned, I was one of the 7 members of the FCTC Impact Assessment Expert Group, and we were asked to do a review of the impact of the FCTC over its first decade. And this consisted of a global evidence review. It consisted of country missions to 12 FCTC parties. Are you getting these slides? Oh yes, it's right behind me. There were many other external reports prepared and submitted by a number of people in this audience. This report, our report was presented at the COP7 in Delhi. So we had a global evidence review, and that's available on our ITC project website as well as the Secretariat's website. And we also are publishing some papers in a special supplement of tobacco control, the impact assessment supplement, and here are some of the articles that are already on the website available, free for download and so on. So you can see Pekka Puska and Mike Daub, who were the chair and the deputy chair of the expert group, have their introduction. We also have some work on articles on the methodology that we followed in this, and also the global evidence review, non-cigarette tobacco products. Tom McInerney has a paper on global governance, Article 6, and impact on defending the FCTC on defending legal challenges to tobacco control measures. So that's available if you want to see some of the work that we did as part of the impact assessment group. Out of this came an interesting analysis of what we looked at was all available data from WHO, 126 countries. Now there are about 200 countries, but turns out these are the largest ones, so this is about 95% of the world's population represented in these 126 countries. And what we did was we examined the relationship between how many measures, WHO calls them the power measures, the articles in FCTC 6, tax, 8, smoke-free, 11, warning labels, labeling and packaging, TAPs, bans, Article 13, and cessation 14. And we examined for these 126 countries how many FCTC of these 5 policies were implemented in the first decade of the treaty. So that's on the x-axis here. And then we examined whether smoking prevalence had gone up or down as a function of how many policies have been implemented. So it turns out, as you can see from this, that the trend is downward, which means that the greater the number of strong implementations of these articles, the more smoking prevalence decreased. This was significant. It was associated with each additional implementation was associated with 1.57 percentage points, or a 7% relative decline. So that means that if a country had implemented 3 policies, these power policies, during that first decade of the treaty, on average, that country reduced their smoking rate by 21% relatively. Extraordinary effects. So the message here is that FCTC works if implemented at the highest level. But let's take a little closer look at this. And what you see is that there were countries that did 0. There was one country that actually went backwards. You can't read it. I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to read the article to find out who it was. But 55 countries actually implemented none of these policies at all in the first decade of the treaty. 45 countries implemented only 1 of the 5 policies. 20 countries implemented only 2 of the 5 policies. Then there were 4 at 3, none at 4, and only 1 at 5. So in other words, the curve, the line tells you that the more you implement the FCTC, the more smoking prevalence reduces. But the problem is, everyone's on the left side. We need to push those countries over to the right. So we can actually quantify this, and we've done this in our subsequent analyses after this paper was published. How much did implementation of the 5 key demand reduction FCTC policies reduce the number of smokers in the first decade? And how much could have been achieved by strong implementation of these 5 policies if everyone did all 5 policies during the first decade of the treaty? In other words, what's the unfulfilled potential of the FCTC because of lack of implementation? Well, fancy table, some arithmetic, but here's what we found. The first decade of the FCTC, highest level implementation was associated with 49 million fewer smokers, a relative reduction of about 5%. not percentage points, relative reduction. In other words, 1 out of every 20 smokers in the country on average, because of the FCTC, was no longer smoking. That's not very high. In the Southeast Asia region, that was 5.8 million fewer smokers. That's about a 2.5% reduction, even lower than the world average. And Western Pacific region, about 3 million fewer smokers, only 3 million fewer smokers. That's less than 1% relative reduction. In other words, from the record of the West Pacific countries in implementation of these policies, fewer than 1 in 100 smokers stop because of the FCTC, associated with the FCTC implementation. That's really low. What would have happened if all 5 of these had been implemented in all of these countries? And you get such extraordinary numbers, I want to share them with you. In the world, there would have been 315 million fewer smokers, of 31%, almost 1/3 of smokers. In the Southeast Asia region, 76 million fewer smokers, 34% reduction, again about 1/3. And finally, in the Western Pacific region, because it was so low to begin with, right, less than 1% relative, 134 million fewer smokers, 35% reduction. These are extraordinary numbers. These are associated with the lack of strong implementation, or implementation at all, of just these key 5 demand reduction policies. Stronger and more accelerated FCTC implementation can lead to tremendous gains in global health. So, in the second decade of the FCTC, we need to strengthen and accelerate implementation of the treaty. We've seen in the first decade of the treaty how that was a period of building the treaty through the number of countries that signed on and ratified the treaty. Also in the development of strong guidelines for a number of the articles. In the second decade, we are pivoting toward what we can do to strengthen and accelerate implementation. And these data suggest that there are going to be tremendous benefits if that can be achieved. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to questions later. Thank you.
True, I think that it is the lack of implementation of the policies that resulted in this status. However, did you notice any problem in terms of the conflict of interest people reported, and that the role of the tobacco industries? Did you notice anything in that?
Well,
did you ask any question about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the findings of the impact assessment expert group was exactly that the number one problem was, of course, industry interference.
Tobacco industries have been aggressively challenging and delaying tobacco control policies which have been proven to reduce tobacco epidemic and protecting people. Many countries in Asia-Pacific region suffer from tobacco industry tactics and interference to weaken tobacco control policies. How much of this gap in implementation of tobacco control relate to tobacco industry interference? What tactics do they use to weaken tobacco control policy measures is going to be addressed by Mary, and you all know Mary, who she is. She is a Senior Policy Advisor, Southeast Asia Tobacco Control Alliance, SIATCA. Mary.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. So as you've heard, that the tobacco industry interference is the biggest hindrance to tobacco control efforts. Philip Morris, in its 2014 strategy to attack tobacco control, said it needed to move tobacco control away from ministries of health, create broader interest in its issues, find allies that cannot be ignored, and put up roadblocks because they are as important as solutions. We have seen in our countries how Philip Morris executed these tactics, and our monitoring reveals that the tobacco industry as a whole have used similar tactics. We've seen the industry step up its communication and interference with the non-health departments, particularly departments of commerce, customs, and trade. Every year, Philip Morris, through the US ASEAN Business Council, has an opportunity to speak to 10 Director Generals of the customs in the ASEAN region on why they should not increase tobacco tax substantially. That is one effective way to shift the issue away from the Ministry of Health. Ministries of Commerce and International Trade are particularly vulnerable to tobacco industry interference, as they are the ones who receive business delegations through business councils and are open to increasing tobacco trade, as we saw recently in Japan Tobacco acquiring a Bangladesh tobacco company through the foreign direct investment deal. That certainly broadens the interest in tobacco as a trade issue and not as a health issue. Last year in the Republic of Korea, during World No Tobacco Day on May 31st, while health groups had programs on World No Tobacco Day, the CEO of KT&G was awarded the Labor Minister's Award for Workplace Gender Equality. And this was quite a shock tactic because it took the attention away from health. This is really outrageous, considering that KT&G is a tobacco company and that it actually has a cigarette brand specifically designed for women and promotes this brand worldwide to girls and women, including here in Indonesia. There is definitely a gap in our efforts to to have more gender-sensitive tobacco control initiatives. Tobacco companies have been funding high-profile research institutes and think tanks, as the UK-based Oxford Economics, that does reports on Asia, the Malaysian Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, and Deloitte in Australia, to conduct research and spew findings that support industry position, be it in tackling illicit trade or even to show why plain packaging does not work. The ASEAN Intellectual Property Association, for example, has sent letters to health ministries in the region telling them why they cannot implement plain packaging because it violates WTO requirements. Front groups and lobby groups such as the International Tobacco Growers Association, APTI and AMTI in Indonesia, Coffee Shop Association in Malaysia, FIFA in India have all been mobilized, and you can hear them mouthing a familiar industry script. Their statements and messages on social media and letters to the governments are meant to shape public health policy and also public opinion. Just as the industry intends, government officials feel pressured simply because they find it hard to ignore these groups. Malaysia, for example, has backed away from its original plans for plain packaging. The tobacco industry offers sweeteners through CSR activities to high-profile community organizations or even enforcement agencies to win public approval and gain access to senior government officials. It was quite surprising for me to read about the charity arm of Mighty Corporation in the Philippines handing out free computers to the police force in Makati to help them improve their work. Surely this is a conflict of interest situation for police officers, as they are responsible for enforcement in tobacco smuggling. Many government officials find themselves endorsing tobacco-related CSR activities, and you find many instances in Bangladesh, here in Indonesia, in Japan, Republic of Korea, and Vietnam. Now, when a government actually succeeds in enacting strong tobacco control measures, and we have seen that across the globe, and the industry has failed in its attempts to dilute, to delay, or to undermine these measures, then lawsuits are filed against these governments as roadblocks to delay tobacco control. We saw industry lawsuits against the Indian, Sri Lankan, and Thai governments for their strong, prominent pictorial health warning legislation. And of course, we're all familiar with the court suit filed against Australia for their plain packaging laws. But all of these countries that I've mentioned have actually persevered in their efforts and have withstood their resolve to continue with their strong legislation. So the gap really is, indeed, it is tobacco industry interference, and these interference will succeed when there is a lack of political will. Now, Article 5.3 of the FCTC is meant for governments to use it to halt industry interference. But we know that Article 5.3 implementation is slow. It's really slow because it's moving at a glacial pace. There is insufficient communication between health departments and the non-health departments about tobacco hazards and about the requirements under Article 5.3 and the FCTC in some instances. Often, the administrative procedure to handle industry interference is not in place in many countries. While we expose the industry's interference tactics, we also need our governments to be accountable to protect public health and to fulfill their obligation to reduce tobacco use. The antidote, therefore, to countering tobacco industry challenges and the tool to protect public health is already available to us and is already in the hands of governments. We have some good examples of good governance and demonstration of political will in our region. So let me provide quickly a few such examples. On implementing FCTC Article 5.3 in 2010, the Philippines became the first country in the Asia Pacific when its civil service collaborated with the Department of Health and issued a joint memorandum circular protecting all civil servants from industry interference. So government officials only interact with the tobacco industry to control, to supervise, and to regulate it. This is the only interaction Filipino officials are meant to have with the industry. No planting of CSR trees, no handing out scholarships to poor children, and no receiving grants from the tobacco industry. While Thailand banned CSR activities last year, just last month, Myanmar has passed an anti-corruption code of ethics for companies and corporations. And the private sector, therefore, in Myanmar now cannot make offering a gift or preferential treatment and political contributions, charitable donations, including CSR activities. Transparency. We know that the industry does not like transparency. Australia and New Zealand ministries of health report on their website all their scheduled meetings with the tobacco industry, and this is an administrative move, and which is quite easily executed. They do not have need to go to Parliament in order to put in place these administrative measures. Now, requiring the marketing expenditure from the tobacco industry is indeed very important. Thailand, for example, now requires the tobacco industry to provide detailed information about its business, including what it spends on marketing. The industry introduces new brands and relaunches existing brands routinely. Expenditure for these should be reported. Asia must maintain low smoking prevalence among females and halt industry targeting of girls and women. For example, countries should ban the sale of lipstick-style pack, cigarette packs, and introduce a standardized packaging for tobacco products. Industry tactics have not stopped the Singapore and the Thai government from pursuing plain packaging. For those of you who attended the launching of the Asian Tobacco Industry Interference Index by SIATCA, would have heard that indeed this is a powerful advocacy tool that governments can use to resist tobacco industry interference. So the 2018 Interference Index now covers 14 countries, 14 Asian countries. It's hot from the press because it was just released here yesterday. And our findings show that there are some countries doing better than others. So countries doing better than others are Brunei, Thailand, and Philippines, for example. And of course, there's always room for improvement. And that there are countries that need to take industry interference more seriously, such as countries at the other end of the spectrum, as in Japan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Now, countries and jurisdictions that are not covered in this survey of 14 countries but have indeed exercised political will to reduce tobacco use and not succumb to industry interference are Australia, Chinese Taipei, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and Singapore. In some countries where federal government is dragging its feet, cities have stepped up and demonstrated political will in enacting stringent tobacco control measures. And here is a shout out to Bogor City in Indonesia and Davao and Balanga City in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let me put it this way. If your city or your country has been sued by the tobacco industry, let me tell you, you are obviously doing something right. Thank you.
Professor Salim, advisor of the National Committee on Tobacco Control Indonesia and former chairperson of the Advisory Council to the President of Republic of Indonesia, will tell us what is happening here. All the audiences are anxious to hear when are you going to ratify the Framework Convention.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, Indonesia participated in formulating the Framework on Convention on Tobacco Control. In the 1990s, Indonesia was very active. But when it came to ratify the FCTC, it was 2003, 2004, Indonesia did not sign. And since then, Indonesia was absent, but yet active participating in the FCTC program. What is happening? The years of the 20th century, Indonesian government was very much dominated by technocratic governments, technocratic experts. The cabinet was more of a technocratic experts. But since the election in the 21st century, came the general election, which then elected political leaders as members of the parliament. This change of a technocratic cabinet into a political cabinet changes the outlook of the Indonesian government from being technocratic to be more politically. And from that angle, Indonesia abstained from signing the FCTC. Here, dear friends, what is really a relationship between democracy, FCTC, and so on? We started with democracy, in which Indonesia has free election at the national level, free to elect the president directly, 264 million people across from Sabang to Merauke, like London to Tehran. 2, we have election of member of parliaments nationally. We have election of regional provincial governors, election of governors, parliament, regional parliaments, direct election, election of the district government and leaders, all free on democratic principles. And that creates the birth of political parties. There were 40 political parties in Indonesia, but in the process of election, it was squeezed into 10 political parties elected by the people. So we have a government, elected government by a political party, but behind all these efforts of general election, political election, let's be frank, democracy is expensive. And when you are a poor country, low-income country, at the lower level of low level of middle-income country, then democracy for you creates an atmosphere of corruption. So the political parties needs financing. Where does he get the financing? Of course, not from the government. And of course, difficult from the local people who are poor. Here, the tobacco industry see an opportunity to make use of this opportunity. and corruption prevails. So, dear friends, all political parties practically have received funds from the tobacco industry. And I'm therefore not surprised if in the parliament proposal comes from the political party that put the tobacco industry in advantageous position. So Indonesia is therefore suffering a situation of corruption, but the people does not stand still. The people react. And what is the reaction? The corruption committee, the anti-corruption committee, has put 3 chairmen of the big political party in jail by 2016. And the parliament of the Indonesian parliament, the chairman of the Indonesian parliament in 2018 is also put in jail. So when, on the other hand, democracy creates corruption, on the other hand, democracy creates reaction, urging the people reaction for a clean government. That is the result of democracy in Indonesia, a positive and a negative side. And in between, the tobacco industry are smart to make use of the environment to bribe the political parties. This creates the difference in the 20th century, a technocratic government, into the 21st century, a political government in which then democracy becomes very important but very costly. And that, gentlemen, explains to me the first part of what is happening, why did Indonesia change, where Indonesia changed her convention of tobacco control depends very much. Will the parliament accept the FCTC? Will the political climate change? How will be the reaction of the Indonesian public? And that will be the second part of my explanation next. Thank you.
No, I think you can even go ahead and tell us what are your suggestions.
Yes,
for
go ahead.
Go on? Okay.
Yeah.
When I like to go on, next then, that the second part.
You want this?
Yeah, mine I do.
You want them? Oh, there we
So, in the second part, I like to explain that the NGOs fight back together with progressive industries, like Mr. Alvin Panigoro. What is happening? Look, NGOs, the Minister of Industry of our cabinet proposed a roadmap of doubling the output of tobacco. A minister in the cabinet, pro-cigarette. Why do you react? Do you think that the Indonesian people remain silent? No. Then you revolt and put the case in the court to ask to review, to repeal this roadmap. And in that circumstances, we won. The people won. And the roadmap has been repealed, has been withdrawn, has not been approved by the government. My point is, we may not sign FCTC, but the spirit of FCTC is in the heart of the people. Second, the political parties, remember, the political parties need money for elections and so on, put on the table a law that set the clove cigarettes as part of the Indonesian cultural heritage that should be protected, that should be everything. Crazy. But what is important is when the president received the debt on his table, my president rejected this proposal, and it's not flying anymore. Third, we are facing a very difficult problem in Indonesia. Since 1986, Indonesia is a middle-income country. Now we are 2018, still middle-income country. We failed to get out of the middle-income trap into a high-income country. Efforts are being made, and our experts and the experts of OECD mentioned us, we need 27 years. So, but by 2043, almost 100 years of our independence, it is calculated that by continuous pattern of development that we now pursue, Indonesia will be by 2043 reaching the high-income country level. And that, dear friend, that ability means that the fighters for development are not the old generation anymore, not the old cracks in the political party, but the new generation. The old party leaders may be corrupt, they will fade away. The new generation is coming up, and they are here in this conference hall. They are the future. So, Madam Chairman, when you ask when will Indonesia sign FCTC, maybe not formally we can set a deadline. Maybe next year, maybe never. But the point is that the Indonesian people, the Indonesian youth are committed to develop Indonesia free of tobacco. Thank you.
Any questions anyone has? Any questions? I think I would like to thank all the speakers on the panel. I know your speech was extremely passionate, and so was Mary's, because Mary is very passionate about the interference of the tobacco industry. He is a researcher. He doesn't say one thing or the other, one way or the other, you know. But it was very important for us to know that Jeff tried to find out what was the hurdles in implementation of the policies. And very clearly he said that he found out that there was the conflict of interest. People pointed out that it was due to the conflict of interest that the implementation could not take place. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers and moderators. Now, we will proceed to the next session, is the closing session. Please, to all moderators and speakers, you may come to your seat. Thank you once again. Let's give a big round of applause to our moderators and speakers.